The morning of August 29th, 1949, 7 o'clock Moscow time. A brilliant flash erupts from a metal tower on the Kazakh steppe. The shockwave rolls outward like a ripple in a still pond. But this pond is 18,000 square kilometers of what Soviet officials called uninhabited land. Except it wasn't uninhabited. Never was. The lie that launched 40 years of human experimentation had just detonated with the force of 22,000 tons of TNT. Before we dive in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. 3 years earlier, Lavrentiy Beria had selected this remote steppe near the Irtysh River. The head of Stalin's secret police needed a place to test the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb. He chose the Semipalatinsk region because, on paper, it looked empty. Rolling grassland stretching to the horizon. Sparse population. Railway access for equipment and personnel. Perfect for keeping secrets. What Beria's maps didn't show were the Kazakh herders, the farming villages, the nomadic families who had called this land home for generations, people whose lives were about to become data points in the world's longest-running radiation experiment. By 1947, construction crews were building what would become known as the Semipalatinsk Test Site, or STS, a sprawling complex of laboratories, bunkers, and observation posts. The main town, later named Kurchatov, rose from nothing, housing for 30,000 Soviet scientists, engineers, and military personnel, all of them sworn to secrecy about what they were building in the Kazakhstan wilderness. RDS-1 sat atop its tower like a metallic egg, the first Soviet nuclear weapon, codenamed First Lightning. The Americans would call it Joe 1 after Stalin himself. At precisely 7 in the morning, Moscow time, the device triggered. The fireball vaporized the tower instantly. The shockwave shattered windows in Kurchatov, 65 kilometers away, and the radioactive plume began its deadly drift across the steppe, following the prevailing winds east-northeast, directly toward the village of Dolon. Dolon sat just 60 kilometers from the test site border, home to Kazakh families who had never heard of nuclear fission, who had no warning that death was riding the wind toward their homes. The fallout clouds swept over their village like morning fog. Invisible, odorless, lethal. External radiation doses in Dolon would later be reconstructed at up to 2.3 Gray. That's enough to cause acute radiation sickness, to damage DNA, to trigger cancers that wouldn't appear for decades. The villagers had just become unwitting test subjects in the Soviet Union's nuclear program. But this was only the beginning. RDS-1 was just the first note in a 40-year symphony of destruction. Over the next 4 decades, the Soviet Union would detonate 456 nuclear weapons at Semipalatinsk, 340 underground, 116 in the atmosphere. Each test, adding to the radioactive burden carried by the Kazakh people. The atmospheric tests alone released 6.6 megatons of explosive force. That's equivalent to 440 Hiroshima bombs. All of it detonated in the backyard of communities that were never supposed to exist. The human cost would become clear only decades later. Up to 1.5 million people exposed to radiation over 4 decades. Elevated cancer rates. Genetic damage passed to children and grandchildren. Cardiovascular disease. Birth defects. A medical disaster masquerading as scientific progress. What happened at Semipalatinsk wasn't an accident. It was policy. A deliberate decision to treat an entire population as laboratory animals, to prioritize nuclear weapons development over human life, to hide the consequences behind a wall of nuclear testing anywhere on Earth. The question isn't whether Semipalatinsk was a crime against humanity. The question is whether the world learned anything from it. 4 years after First Lightning, the Soviet nuclear program had evolved. No longer content with simple atomic bombs, they wanted something bigger. Something that could obliterate entire cities with a single device. On August 12, 1953, they got it. RDS-6S lifted off from Semipalatinsk airfield at dawn, a Tupolev bomber, carrying humanity's first practical hydrogen bomb. The device used a revolutionary layer cake design, alternating layers of fissile and fusible material, more compact than American designs, and far more deadly. The bomb fell through the morning air like a metal coffin. 400 kilotons of thermonuclear fury, nearly 20 times more powerful than the device that destroyed Hiroshima. When it detonated above the Kazakh steppe, the fireball was visible from 300 kilometers away. The mushroom cloud climbed 30 kilometers into the stratosphere. Radioactive debris scattered across an area larger than some European countries. In villages downwind, children played in ash that fell like snow. Their parents had no idea they were watching their children absorb doses of radiation that would kill them decades later. But even RDS-6S was just a warm-up. The real monster was still to come. November 22nd, 1955. RDS-37, the Soviet Union's first true two-stage hydrogen bomb. The device was so large it barely fit inside the bomber. So powerful that Soviet scientists weren't sure what would happen when they detonated it. They aimed for 800 kilotons. They got 1.6 megatons, double what they expected. At 1,550 meters above the test site, RDS-37 exploded. The fireball reached 4.6 kilometers in diameter. The heat flash was visible from 1,000 kilometers away. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out communications across Kazakhstan. The shockwave traveled outward at the speed of sound, flattening everything within a 50-kilometer radius. In Kurchatov, 65 kilometers from ground zero, every window in the city shattered simultaneously. Glass fragments tore through the air like shrapnel. At least one person died. Dozens more were hospitalized with severe lacerations. These were the Soviet Union's own nuclear workers, living in a city built specifically for the weapons program. If RDS-37 could kill and injure them at that distance, what was it doing to the unprotected villages scattered across the steppe? The Kazakhs living downwind had no concrete bunkers, no blast-resistant windows, no advance warning. Many lived in traditional felt yurts that offered no protection against the massive overpressure wave. Soviet officials recorded the technical data with scientific precision. Yield calculations, radiation measurements, blast damage assessments, but they kept no records of what happened to the human test subjects living in the fallout zone. By 1955, the pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't just weapons testing, it was systematic human experimentation on an unprecedented scale. Each detonation provided data not just on weapons effects, but on radiation exposure. The Soviet military wanted to know how much radiation a population could absorb and still remain functional. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today, and if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Soviet medical teams began appearing in affected villages after major tests. They claimed to be conducting routine health surveys, drawing blood samples, taking X-rays, documenting symptoms. The villagers thought they were receiving free healthcare. In reality, they were being studied like laboratory animals. The doctors were gathering data on acute radiation syndrome, long-term cancer development, genetic damage, reproductive health impacts, all without telling the subjects what was being done to them. The data was invaluable for Soviet nuclear planners. They needed to know how their weapons would affect enemy populations, how much fallout would disable a city, how quickly people would sicken and die. The Kazakh villagers were providing that information with their bodies. In Dolan, the village closest to the original test site, the effects were becoming undeniable. Cancer rates were climbing. Birth defects were increasing. Children were dying of leukemia at rates far above normal. But Soviet authorities had a different explanation. Poor hygiene, inadequate nutrition, genetic predisposition, anything except radiation exposure. The official position was that nuclear testing posed no threat to local populations. Meanwhile, the testing continued to escalate. By 1962, the Soviet Union had detonated 116 atmospheric nuclear weapons at Semipalatinsk. The combined yield was equivalent to 440 Hiroshima bombs, all of it released into the air above communities that had never consented to be part of the experiment. Fallout from some tests was detectable 300 kilometers downwind. Cesium-137 contaminated pastures where cattle grazed. Strontium-90 concentrated in the bones of children drinking contaminated milk. Plutonium particles settled into the soil where families grew their food. The radioactive contamination was building up in the environment, in the food chain, in human bodies. Each test added to the cumulative burden carried by the Kazakh people, a burden that would persist for decades. But as international pressure mounted against atmospheric testing, the Soviet Union faced a choice: continue the human experiment in full view of the world, or find a way to hide the evidence underground. The decision they made would define the next phase of the Semipalatinsk nightmare and reveal just how far they were willing to go to perfect their weapons of mass destruction. The atmospheric tests were ending, but the human experiment was far from over. In fact, it was about to get much worse. October 11th, 1961. The age of atmospheric testing was ending. Not from conscience, from politics. The world was watching now. Satellite photography was revealing the scope of nuclear testing. International pressure was mounting. The Soviet Union needed to take its human experiment underground. Degolin Mountain became the new laboratory, a granite massif rising from the Kazakh steppe like a natural fortress. Soviet engineers began drilling horizontal tunnels deep into the rock. Each tunnel would become the tomb for a nuclear device. And a new chapter in the systematic irradiation of the local population. The first underground test produced a 1-kiloton explosion, modest by Semipalatinsk standards. But the principle was established. Nuclear weapons could be tested in secret, away from prying eyes, hidden beneath tons of granite and earth. By August 5, 1963, even this limited secrecy was under threat. The Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed in Moscow, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. Underground testing remained legal, a loophole the Soviet Union would exploit for the next 26 years. The treaty was supposed to reduce radioactive fallout, to protect human health, to limit the environmental damage from nuclear testing. But at Semipalatinsk, it simply moved the experiment deeper underground. Over the next 3 decades, Soviet engineers would bore 181 tunnels into Degolin Mountain, each tunnel designed for multiple nuclear tests. 215 underground explosions in total, a subterranean constellation of radioactive devastation. But underground testing wasn't as clean as the Soviets claimed. Many tests vented radioactive gases to the surface, contaminating the air with the same isotopes as atmospheric tests. Just in smaller, more concentrated doses, the tunnels intersected groundwater in about 1/3 of cases. Radioactive contamination began migrating through the underground water system, spreading beneath the surface like an invisible cancer, moving toward wells and springs used by local communities. Above ground, the Soviet Union was perfecting new forms of nuclear terror. January 15, 1965. The Chagan shot, not a weapons test, but something worse. An experiment in nuclear excavation. The 140-kiloton device was buried in the bed of the Chagan River. The goal was to create an artificial lake using nuclear explosives, to prove that atomic energy could reshape the landscape itself, to turn weapons of mass destruction into tools of civil engineering. The explosion vaporized 400,000 tons of rock and soil. It hurled radioactive debris across the steppe. It created a crater 400 meters wide and 100 meters deep, and it left behind what locals would call atomic lake. The lake, filled with groundwater, contaminated by fission products, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium isotopes with half-lives measured in millennia. The water glowed with a faint blue luminescence, beautiful and utterly lethal. Soviet scientists proclaimed the Chagan test a success, proof that nuclear explosives could serve peaceful purposes. They published papers describing the potential for nuclear excavation projects, canals carved by hydrogen bombs, harbors blasted from solid rock, mountains moved by the power of the atom. But the Kazakh herders living near Chagan knew better. Their livestock began dying after drinking from streams fed by the atomic lake. Pastures downwind from the crater became barren wastelands. Children playing near the contaminated water developed mysterious illnesses. The human experiment was expanding, no longer limited to weapons tests, now encompassing the deliberate contamination of the environment itself. The Soviet Union was learning how much radioactive poison an ecosystem could absorb, how long contamination would persist, how it would move through food chains and water systems. The data was invaluable for military planners. Nuclear weapons weren't just about immediate destruction. They were about long-term area denial, about making territory uninhabitable for decades or centuries. The Kazakh steppe was providing a real-world laboratory for studying these effects. Through the 1970s and 80s, the underground testing program continued to escalate. More tunnels, more explosions, more radioactive contamination seeping into the groundwater. The granite of Degolin Mountain was becoming a honeycomb of radioactive caverns. Each test added to the cumulative radiation burden carried by the local population. External doses from vented gases, internal doses from contaminated food and water, genetic damage accumulating in DNA, cancer cells beginning their slow, lethal multiplication. Soviet medical teams continued their health surveys in affected villages, drawing blood samples from people who didn't understand why, documenting the progression of radiation-induced diseases. building a database of human suffering disguised as scientific research. By the mid-1980s, the evidence was overwhelming. Cancer rates in the Semipalatinsk region were far above normal. Birth defects were increasing. Genetic mutations were being passed to children and grandchildren. The human cost of 4 decades of nuclear testing was becoming impossible to hide. But the Soviet system was designed to suppress such information. Doctors who reported unusual disease patterns were silenced. Research that linked health problems to radiation exposure was classified. Families affected by nuclear testing were told their illnesses had other causes. The truth was a state secret, more closely guarded than the technical specifications of the weapons themselves, because the truth would reveal that the Soviet Union had conducted medical experiments on its own people, without consent, without warning, without any intention of stopping. As the 1980s drew to a close, cracks were beginning to appear in the wall of secrecy. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were creating space for dissent. For the first time since 1949, Soviet citizens could begin to speak about what had been done to them, and they were preparing to demand answers. The human experiment at Semipalatinsk was about to face its first real challenge, not from international pressure, but from the people who had been its unwitting subjects for 40 years. The Kazakh people were waking up, and they were angry. March 12, 1989. Semipalatinsk city. For the first time in 40 years, people were gathering in the streets, not to celebrate Soviet nuclear achievements, to demand they stop. The Nevada-Semipalatinsk movement was born from decades of suppressed rage, and one undeniable fact: the human experiment had to end. The protesters carried signs in Russian and Kazakh. "Stop the tests. We are not laboratory rats. Our children deserve to live." Simple words that carried the weight of 4 decades of suffering. The crowd grew larger as news spread. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. Soviet authorities had never seen anything like it. A direct challenge to the nuclear program. In public, with television cameras rolling, the wall of secrecy that had protected Semipalatinsk for 40 years was crumbling. Within months, the movement had collected over 1 million signatures. Kazakh villagers who had never been allowed to speak, Russian scientists who had kept silent for decades, international activists linking Semipalatinsk to Nevada Test Site protests, a global coalition demanding an end to nuclear testing. The Soviet government was facing an impossible situation. Gorbachev's glasnost policies meant they couldn't simply arrest the protesters. But the nuclear program was still a state priority. The military insisted testing was essential for national security. Then came August 29, 1989, the 40th anniversary of RDS-1. Instead of celebrating Soviet nuclear achievements, protesters gathered at the test site itself, demanding access to the land their families had been forced to abandon. For the first time, ordinary Kazakhs saw the infrastructure of their oppression, the concrete bunkers where Soviet officials had watched their villages being irradiated, the blast-resistant buildings that protected weapons scientists while leaving villagers defenseless, the roads that connected test areas to comfortable housing in Kurchatov. The contrast was devastating. Miles of sophisticated facilities built to study nuclear weapons effects, while 60 kilometers away, Dolon had never received adequate medical care for radiation-induced cancers. The disparity revealed the true nature of Semipalatinsk, not a scientific research program, but a system designed to treat human beings as expendable test subjects. As protests continued through 1990 and 91, the Soviet Union itself began to collapse. The Communist Party was losing control. Republics were declaring independence. The nuclear program was running out of political protection. On August 29, 1991, President Nursultan Nazarbayev the beginning. The radioactive legacy of Semipalatinsk would persist for centuries. Plutonium isotopes with 24,000-year half-lives, contaminated groundwater migrating through underground aquifers, cancer clusters that would continue appearing for decades. International agencies finally gained access to assess the damage. The International Atomic Energy Agency arrived in 1993. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Entire areas with radiation levels hundreds of times above background. Contaminated soil that would remain dangerous for millennia. The most dangerous legacy was in Degelen Mountain. 181 tunnels honeycombed with radioactive residues, many containing weapons-grade plutonium and highly enriched uranium, materials that terrorists could use to build dirty bombs or crude nuclear weapons. A tri-national operation began in 1997. The the United States, Russia, and Kazakhstan working together to seal the tunnels, to secure the radioactive materials, to prevent nuclear terrorism. $150 million over 15 years. But the human cost couldn't be secured or sealed away. Medical registries tracked cancer rates among exposed populations. 19,000 people in the Semipalatinsk historical cohort. Their medical data providing evidence of radiation's long-term effects. The results were unambiguous. Elevated rates of solid cancers decades after exposure. Increased cardiovascular mortality. Genetic mutations passed to children and grandchildren. A transgenerational legacy of nuclear testing. Some families showed genetic mutation rates 1.8 times higher than normal. DNA damage from their grandparents' radiation exposure. Proof that nuclear testing doesn't just affect the directly exposed. It damages the genetic heritage of entire populations. Today, most of the former test site shows radiation levels near background normal, but hotspots remain off-limits. Lake Chagan still glows with residual contamination. Ground Zero areas are marked with warning signs in multiple languages. Monuments to humanity's capacity for self-destruction. December 2nd, 2009. The United Nations declared August 29th the International Day Against Nuclear Tests, linking the date of the first Soviet test to the closure of Semipalatinsk, a global reminder of what nuclear weapons cost in human terms. Kazakhstan leveraged its Semipalatinsk experience to champion nuclear disarmament. The Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty was signed at Semipalatinsk in 2006, turning a site of mass destruction into a symbol of peace. But the lessons of Semipalatinsk extend far beyond nuclear policy. They reveal what happens when governments treat their own people as experimental subjects, when scientific progress is pursued without ethical constraints, when state secrecy protects institutional crimes against humanity. The Kazakh people who suffered through 40 years of nuclear testing didn't just survive. They organized. They demanded accountability. They forced one of history's most secretive programs into the light. Their resistance reminds us that no government has the right to experiment on its own people. Semipalatinsk was described as a decades-long human experiment, but it was more than that. It was a preview of what happens when nuclear weapons become routine tools of statecraft, when the pursuit of military advantage overrides basic human rights, when entire populations become acceptable casualties in strategic competitions. Today, tourists can visit parts of the former Semipalatinsk Test Site. They see concrete ruins scattered across the steppe, memorial plaques marking significant test locations, warning signs protecting visitors from residual contamination. What they can't see are the 456 explosions that once shook this ground, the radioactive clouds that drifted over villages, the children who played in contaminated ash, the families destroyed by cancers that took decades to develop. The real legacy of Semipalatinsk isn't in its craters or contaminated zones. It's in the international movement to prevent nuclear testing, in the medical knowledge gained from studying radiation's long-term effects, in the reminder that weapons of mass destruction always claim innocent victims. If this story challenges you to think differently about nuclear weapons and government accountability, consider subscribing and sharing it with others, because the only way to prevent future Semipalatinsks is to remember what happened at the first one. The steppe is quiet now. No more explosions shake the earth. No more radioactive clouds drift across the horizon. But the questions raised by 40 years of human experimentation echo still. How many people is a weapons program worth? How much suffering can be justified by national security? And when governments conduct experiments on their own citizens, who decides when enough is enough? At Semipalatinsk, the answer came from the people themselves. 1 million signatures at a time. The human experiment is over. The human responsibility has just begun.